All right, ready for another deep dive? Today we're tackling a pretty big concept, God's compassion.
A big one for sure.
And to guide us, we've got two really interesting articles. One's called The God of Great Compassion, Embracing His Divine Love and Leaving It Out.
Okay.
And the other one, well, it's pretty straightforward, just The God of Great
Oh,
Compassion.
that's straight to the point.
They both really dig into, like, what does compassion actually mean theologically? How do we see it in the Bible?
Hmm.
And the big question, what's it got to do with us?
Right. How do we live it out?
Exactly. Now, something that jumped out at me was this idea that God's compassion is like totally tied to his integrity.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, it's like because of his promises, his compassion is just there. It's built in. And both articles are really clear. This isn't just some theory. It's like the model for how we should treat each other.
I see. So there's a practical application.
Big time.
Yeah.
But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's back up a sec. What is compassion in this context?
Right.
Is it like just a fancy way of saying kindness or love?
It's a good question. Got to start there. Compassion, it definitely overlaps with love and kindness, but it goes deeper.
Deeper, okay.
In theology, God's compassion is this, like wellspring of pity and mercy.
Mm-hmm.
It pushes him to act for his creation, even when, well, humanity makes some not so great choices.
You can say that again. Seriously, the Bible's got stories where I'd be like, okay, that's IT.
Oh, yeah.
Like in 2 Kings, there's that part where God shows compassion for the Israelites even after they'd been, to put it nicely, messing up.
Yeah.
Can you break that down for us?
Sure thing. You're talking about 2 Kings 13.23. It really highlights God's steadfast compassion, even when, there's disobedience.
Right.
The Israelites had turned away from God, like over and over,
Mm.
worshiping other gods, breaking their covenant.
Yeah, not good.
But the text says God still chose to have compassion on them.
Wow.
And the reason, because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
So even though they messed up, like majorly, God's commitment to his promises, that didn't budge.
Exactly. It didn't waver. And that's what's so powerful here. This wasn't random compassion. It was directly because he's faithful to his covenant.
Mm-hmm.
It tells us something huge about God's character. Even when we stray, he's anchored to those promises.
That's pretty amazing. It's like his compassion proves his integrity,
Yeah.
It's not about just being nice. It's about sticking to his word. A pretty big takeaway, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It shows that God's compassion is not flimsy or, here today, gone tomorrow. It's rooted in who he is.
Which leads us to this whole God as a compassionate father idea.
Right.
One article quotes Psalm 103.13. It compares God's compassion to a father's love for his kids.
Okay.
It even says he's obligated to show mercy. But that word obligated, doesn't that make it sound kind of cold? Like, compassion's just a chore. He has to do.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. That's a common way to misunderstand it.
Is it?
You got to remember translations sometimes miss the little things, the nuance. The Hebrew word, it can also mean being bound by love.
Ah, so it's not like a rule book obligation.
No, it's this deep love that drives God to care for his children. Although the psalm does go on to say this compassion is, like, especially for those who fear him.
Okay, now that's interesting. I gotta admit, when I hear fear God, my mind goes straight to like hiding under the bed terrified. Are we talking about that kind of fear?
Not quite. Fear here has a different flavor. Less about terror, more about approaching God with reverence, respect,
Yeah, okay.
acknowledging his authority, getting his power, but also trusting his goodness.
So more like the deep respect you have for someone you truly admire, someone whose wisdom you trust completely.
Exactly. It's recognizing who God is and responding the right way. And this kind of, let's say, reverential fear, it actually opens us up to experience God's compassion even more.
Now that makes a lot of sense. Both articles point to Jesus as like the ultimate example of God's compassion in action. One even quotes Matthew 9.36, where it says, Jesus was moved with compassion when he saw the crowds. What's the lesson there?
It shows us beautifully how Jesus, being fully God and fully human, embodies God's compassion in a way we can relate to.
Right.
Imagine seeing those crowds suffering, lost, hurting. It stirred up this deep pity and mercy in him.
And that fueled his whole ministry.
Exactly. Every miracle, every teaching, every healing, it all flowed from that compassion. And ultimately, it led him to the cross. that
Yeah.
self-sacrifice, giving his life for humanity.
Yeah.
It's the most powerful, the most radical display of God's compassion we can even imagine.
No doubt about it. Now, both articles are clear. We're not supposed to just sit back and admire God's compassion.
Right.
They challenge us to actually live it. But how? What are we supposed to do with this information?
Well, one points to Ephesians 4:32. Lays it out pretty simply. Be kind to one another, compassionate, forgiving one another, just as God forgave you in Christ. It's a powerful call, urging us to become like walking examples of that compassion. The world needs it.
So it's not enough to just feel bad for people. We got to turn those feelings into action. But what does that look like day to day? How do we actually do that?
They give us some practical steps. First is empathy,
Empathy.
putting ourselves in other people's shoes, really understanding their pain and responding with genuine care.
So like if a coworker's going through a rough time, I don't just say, oh, I'm sorry. I actually listen and offer real support.
Exactly. Or maybe it's choosing to forgive a friend who hurt us, even if it's hard, or volunteering at a soup kitchen, donating to charity. It's about taking that compassion and turning it into something real, something tangible.
Those are great examples. I think sometimes we get stuck on this changing the world idea and forget that compassion can also be in those small, everyday moments.
You got it. Sometimes the most profound ways we show compassion are in those simple acts of kindness. A listening ear, a helping hand, a word of encouragement. They can make all the difference.
I love that. But it makes you wonder, if God's compassion is so powerful, why does it feel like we're up against like a brick wall sometimes? There's so much suffering. How do we make sense of that with a God who's supposed to be all compassionate?
That's a tough one. And if we're being honest, there's no easy answer.
Yeah.
But I think wrestling with those tough questions, it's part of the journey.
So it's okay to have doubts, to question. It doesn't mean our faith is weak.
No, not at all. In fact, I think wrestling with those questions can actually make our faith stronger.
Real.
It forces us to really grapple with who God is,
Yeah.
with his plan, which can be mysterious. And that can lead to a deeper understanding of his compassion.
That's a different way of looking at it than I'm used to. But I like it. It feels more honest, more real.
Faith isn't about just blindly accepting things. It's about trusting God, even when we don't get everything.
Yeah.
Sometimes that means sitting with the tough stuff, acknowledging the tension, but holding on to that belief that God is good, even when things are hard.
Okay, that's a lot to unpack, but I think I'm starting to get it. So if we're going to really embody God's compassion, we got to embrace the mess, the complexity, even the doubt.
Exactly. It might not always be easy, might not always feel good, but it's in those messy, uncomfortable moments that we truly reflect God's heart.
I'm seeing a pattern here. It seems like embracing the hard stuff is kind of a theme in Christianity, wouldn't you say?
You're absolutely right. It's in those moments, the moments of surrender, of vulnerability, of choosing love, even when it hurts. That's where we experience God's grace, and it changes us.
That is a pretty profound thought to end on.
You know, it's funny, you mentioning embracing the hard stuff.
Yeah.
It reminds me of something C.S. Lewis wrote once.
Oh.
He said, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world.
Wow.
Maybe those tough questions, the tension we feel,
Yeah.
is God's way of getting our attention, like inviting us closer to him.
I've never thought about it that way, but that really hits home. It's like in those moments of doubt, of struggle,
Yeah.
we're actually being pulled towards God, even if it doesn't feel like it at the time.
Exactly. It's when we're forced to face our limits, our need for grace. That's where God's compassion meets us, right where we are, messy, broken, all of it.
That's beautiful. Okay, so we've talked about what compassion is, how it's tied to God's integrity, even how Jesus was the perfect example of it. But I still feel like there's a piece missing.
Let's know.
If God's compassion is this powerful force, like both articles say, how do we actually see it working in the world?
That's a great question, and it's tricky because a lot of times God's compassion works in quiet, hidden ways.
Hidden. Okay.
But that doesn't mean it's not there. Think about it. Have you ever felt completely lost, alone, and then out of nowhere something happens, someone shows up, and you feel this overwhelming sense of relief, like you're not alone anymore?
You know, now that you mention it, I can think of a couple times like that. Like when I was going through a really rough breakup,
Yeah.
I was heartbroken, lost. And this old friend, hadn't talked to her in years, reached out. She just listened for hours. No judgment. It was exactly what I needed.
Exactly. That's what I'm talking about, those moments of unexpected kindness where you feel hope, comfort, That's often God's compassion working through other people.
Wow. So it's not always about these huge, dramatic miracles. It's about the small, everyday acts of love and kindness that have a big impact.
You got it. Think about all those stories in the Gospels. Jesus healing the sick, comforting those who are grieving, reaching out to the marginalized.
Hmm.
It's like his compassion drives him to act,
Hmm.
to intervene for those who are hurting, to bring healing. And that same compassion is there for us today, woven into everything, waiting for us to tap into it, to let it flow through us.
Okay, but if that's true, if God's compassion is so available, why is there so much suffering? Why do bad things happen to good people?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And honestly, I wish I had a simple answer. But some things, we may never fully understand this side of heaven.
Yeah.
But here's what I do know. God does not create suffering. He doesn't enjoy our pain. In fact, he grieves with us. He weeps with us.
That makes me think of that part in John 11 where Jesus weeps at Lazarus' tomb, even though he knows he's about to raise him from the dead.
Yes, it's like even facing death, even in the middle of suffering, God's compassion is right there.
So how do we reconcile those two things? A God who is all-powerful, all-compassionate,
Right.
and a world that's full of so much pain.
I think the key is remembering that we live in a broken world, a world messed up by sin, by selfishness. And because of that, suffering is just part of being human. But that doesn't mean God isn't there, that he doesn't care. In fact, I think it's when we're suffering that his compassion shines even brighter.
It's like in the darkest times, that's when we see his love the most.
Exactly. It's about walking with us through those tough times, reminding us we're not alone, that he's there every step of the way.
So how does knowing that change how we live? If we believe God is with us in our suffering, how does that affect our actions, our choices?
It changes everything.
Yeah.
Because if we believe that, then we're called to be his hands and feet in the world.
What do you mean?
We're called to be agents of his compassion, to bring comfort, hope, healing to those who are hurting.
I'm starting to see a theme here. Everything we've been talking about, from God's integrity to Jesus's example to how we're supposed to live, it all goes back to this idea of compassion as the driving force.
You're absolutely right. Compassion is at the very heart of the gospel. It's who God is, how he relates to us, and it's the basis for how we should relate to each other.
Okay, so we've talked about what compassion is, how it's shown in God and Jesus, even the tension between God's compassion and suffering, but I still feel like something's missing. How do we actually live this out? How do we make this idea of compassion real in our everyday lives?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one each of us has to figure out. But I think it starts with awareness.
Awareness, okay.
If we're always tuned into God's compassion for us, we're more likely to notice those around us who are hurting, lost, needing some grace.
So we need to develop a kind of compassion radar, always looking for chances to be kind, to love.
Yeah, exactly. It's about being intentional, making a choice to respond with compassion, even when it's inconvenient, when it's tough. Remember, compassion isn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes the most powerful acts are the smallest ones: a listening ear, a helping hand, a kind word. They can spread outward like ripples.
It's like that Mother Teresa quote, "Not all of us can do great things, but we can do small things with great love." It reminds us that it's not about what we're capable of, but whether we're willing.
Absolutely. Compassion is a choice we make every day to see the world through God's love and respond that way.
Okay, so we're called to be compassionate, we got to be intentional, and remember that small acts matter. But let's be real, sometimes compassion is hard. It's messy, not always easy or comfortable. How do we deal with that?
You're right, it's not always sunshine and roses. It can be tough, even painful sometimes. But that's where grace comes in. We got to remember we're not alone in this. God's grace is enough for us, even when we're weak.
So it's okay to struggle, to feel like we're not good enough, to even mess up.
Oh, of course. We're all human. We're all works in progress, right? The important thing is that we keep trying, keep learning, keep growing in how we show compassion.
That's encouraging to hear. Okay, we've covered a lot. We've talked about the theology of compassion, how Jesus lived it out, even the tension between God's compassion and the suffering in the world. But before we move on, I want to go back to something you said earlier about how sometimes doubt can actually make our faith stronger. Can you say more about that?
Sure. I think a lot of people think faith means you just blindly accept everything, never question, never doubt. But that's not real faith at all. Real faith means wrestling with those tough questions, with the complicated parts of life.
Right.
And in the end, choosing to trust God, even when we don't get it all.
So we shouldn't try to bury our doubts, pretend they're not there.
Exactly. Bring them to God. Lay them out and ask for his help to understand. And yeah, sometimes that process is messy, it's uncomfortable, but it's through that our faith gets refined, made stronger, and becomes deeper.
That's so different from how I was raised, but it's freeing. It means we can be honest with God, with ourselves, and admit we don't have all the answers.
Exactly. And that's where humility comes in. Humility is crucial for compassion because it lets us see ourselves and others with grace, recognizing that we're all broken, we all mess up, and we all need forgiveness.
Okay, I'm really seeing how all this connects. Compassion, integrity, grace, humility. These aren't just ideas, they're all linked together. They shape how we live, how we see the world, how we treat each other.
You're absolutely right. And when we live those out, when we let them change our hearts and our actions, we become living examples of God's love.
Wow, that's powerful. And I think it's a perfect place to pause for now. When we come back, we'll explore how this understanding of compassion can impact not just our own lives, but our communities and the world around us. Welcome back. Really been thinking about this idea of compassion's power to change things.
It's pretty incredible, isn't it? Not just in our own lives, but like the world as a whole.
Yeah, exactly. We've gone through what compassion is, how it's shown in God and Jesus.
Right.
Even that tension between God's compassion and, well, all the suffering we see. But now I want to zoom out a bit. How does this understanding of compassion actually affect our communities, the world around us?
It's a big question, especially now when things feel so divided, so fractured. If compassion is really at the heart of what we believe, how do we put it into action, make a real difference?
Yeah, how do we go beyond just good intentions?
Well, I think we got to realize compassion is not just individual acts of kindness. Those are important, but
There's more.
it's also about systemic change, like tackling the root causes of suffering, injustice, working to make things fairer for everyone.
So it's not enough to just volunteer or donate. We have to actually try to dismantle the systems that cause poverty, inequality, all of that.
Exactly. Compassion pushes us past just charity into that hard work of real change. It means looking at our own biases, facing how we might be part of the problem,
Right.
and then working to build a world that's just compassionate for everybody.
That's a big task. Feels kind of overwhelming, honestly. Where do we even start?
I'd say it starts with education. We got to learn about the issues that cause suffering, whether it's poverty, racial injustice, climate change, you name it.
Knowledge is power, right? If we get it, we can do something about it.
Exactly. The more we learn, the better equipped we are to act. And that action can take lots of forms. Maybe advocating for policy changes, supporting organizations, doing good work, even just having tough conversations with people who disagree with us.
So using our voices, our resources, our influence.
Exactly. To push for change. It's not always easy, not always comfortable. Speaking truth to power, challenging the status quo. That can be really hard.
Yeah.
But remember, compassion often means stepping outside our comfort zones and doing those hard things.
It makes me think of that story, The Good Samaritan.
Oh, good one.
It's not just helping the guy who got robbed, it's about preventing that kind of stuff from happening in the first place.
Exactly. He doesn't just patch him up. He pays for his care, promises us to come back. It's like full circle compassion, taking care of the immediate need, but also the bigger picture.
So how do we do that? How do we cultivate that kind of compassion in our lives? Move beyond just reacting to suffering and actually try to fix the root causes.
I think it starts with a perspective shift. Instead of compassion being a reaction, it becomes our way of life, the lens we see everything through.
So it's not just something we do, it's who we are.
Right. It becomes part of our daily routines, our relationships, our work, our politics, everything.
Like Gandhi said, be the change you want to see.
Exactly. It's not just talk, it's action. It's living it out.
Makes you wonder, if we all really embrace that, what would the world look like?
Good question. And when we do that, when compassion is truly how we live, we become like these change agents. We inspire others to do the same, and it creates this ripple effect that can change communities, even whole societies.
That's pretty amazing to think about. But I gotta be honest, the systemic change thing still feels huge, intimidating. Like, what can one person really do?
I get it. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by how big the problems are.
Yeah.
But remember, small acts matter. Don't underestimate the power of your choices, your voice, your actions.
So even if I can't solve all the world's problems, I can still make a difference where I am.
Absolutely. Every little bit of kindness, every encouraging word, every time you learn about injustice or teach someone else about it, it all adds up to a more compassionate world. And remember, you're not alone in this. There are so many people, so many groups out there fighting for a better world. Find them, connect with them, join the movement.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation, given me a lot to think about for sure. But if there's one thing I want our listeners to take away from all this, it's that compassion isn't just a feeling.
Like so much more.
It's a call to action. It's a call to be the change we want to see.
Couldn't said it better myself. And as we wrap up, I want to leave everyone with this. If we truly get God's compassion, if we let it change us inside and out, well, we have the power to change the world. One act of kindness at a time, one conversation at a time, one step at a time.
Well said. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into God's compassion. Hope it's been thought-provoking, maybe a little challenging, and definitely inspiring. Go out there and be that change. Until next time, keep diving deep.